World War I was a war of artillery. But while everyone talks about the horrors of being under artillery fire, we've never heard how bad life was for the men firing those guns. Now you're going to see the other side of the greatest killer of the First World War. Just before World War I began, the artillery went through a major transformation. Smokeless powder, one-piece breech-loaded ammunition, and most importantly, the French invention of the recoil absorber, turned the artillery into something far deadlier than anyone could imagine. The crew of an old field gun would need to put the gun back in place after each shot, as it would roll backwards several feet every time it fired. This was called relaying, and it slowed the whole process of firing tremendously. Black powder made a huge white cloud after each shot, which revealed the battery's position and also blocked the crew's own view, so they couldn't see where their shots landed. But then the French came up with the recoil system. The idea was to let only the barrel slide back while the carriage and wheels stay in place. After firing, the barrel slides back and a piston forces oil through a small opening, so the pressure breaks the barrel smoothly. And in the same movement, it squeezes air into a second cylinder, which then pushes the barrel back into firing position. Smokeless powder doesn't advertise your position as much as you can see where you're shooting, while the breech and one-piece ammunition make reloading faster than ever. Instead of 2 to 3 aimed shots a minute, now a crew could put out up to 20 for a brief moment. However, before the Great War began, armies thought of artillery as a supporting arm, not something that would become the main killer on the battlefield. Its job was to add firepower to the infantry and cavalry, and hit the enemy in the open with shrapnel, so field guns were kept light enough to be dragged by horses and keep up with the infantry. Most of the guns were firing directly at the targets they could see, almost in a straight line, using only half of their actual range. Indirect fire just wasn't seen as nearly as important as it would become in a few months. These guns couldn't hit anything behind the direct line of sight, like someone dug into trenches. And this is where the soon-to-be famous howitzers came in. These have a shorter barrel and a lower shell speed, and they fire upward at a high angle. The shell climbs steeply and falls just as steeply onto the unfortunate man who thought he was safe behind cover. And there was one more secret artillery piece that would shock the world, and you're going to hear about it in a bit. But the main artillery piece was those quick-firing field guns. However, this was about to change. Now, the main shell of the time was shrapnel, which was timed to explode over the battlefield and, as the name says, spray shrapnel and a few hundred metal balls over the exposed enemy soldiers. There were also high explosive shells that were effective against lighter fortifications and hard targets, although no one really bothered with them much before the war began. In other words, just like the machine gun, artillery evolved significantly in a few short years, but was never tested on such a large scale. And it was now going to be used naively, just like the old field guns in almost Napoleonic-style tactics. And the result is going to be horrifying. In the opening weeks of the war, the guns were moved by horses, usually 6 horses per gun, while the gun crew was between 6 and 10 men, each with a specific job. They'd gallop into position, disconnect the gun, move the horses back, and prepare everything for firing. Well, the enemy now had that same artillery and those machine guns too, only dug into defensive positions. So that system didn't go quite so well. When the British tried that against the prepared German defensive lines, with the guns hidden in the rear, they got obliterated in a few hours. Most of their men and horses were killed, and the guns were left stranded in the middle of the battlefield. This frontal attack tactic was attempted by all armies early in the war, and each time it failed catastrophically. Then they desperately tried to outflank each other, until they ran out of space when they hit the North Sea and the Swiss border in the south. After that, the Western Front got stuck in miles and miles of trenches and barbed wire, and the terrifying job of the artillery and their crews was now only getting started. Now, before we go into how bad the life of artillery crews was, do you remember I mentioned one secretive artillery piece? You see, the forts of the time were made to withstand fire from the guns of that era, like those lighter field guns you've heard about. The heaviest guns of the day were around 200 millimeters in caliber, so the forts had concrete walls up to 4 meters thick to take such hits. Well, the Germans knew that they had to defeat those forts if they wanted to win the war, so they made a howitzer of 420mm caliber, which got the nickname Big Bertha. These things weighed some 40 tons and fired a shell of about 800 kilograms with a delayed fuse, so it would go deep into the concrete before it went bang. These had to be hauled by tractors and then assembled near the target, but when one of those shells hit something, well, it's not going to stand in one piece anymore. And that's how those fortresses, thought to be indestructible, got turned into rubble so early in the war, which completely ended the era of fortresses. The Austro-Hungarians also lent the Germans their Skoda super heavy 305mm mortars for blasting those forts. The point is that, early in the war, the artillery had outclassed both the forts and the infantry caught in the open, and it then led directly to the trench stalemate, where it became the central weapon of the war. Because all sides were now dug in, the way of firing was almost exclusively indirect, meaning the artillery crews were shooting at the targets over the ridges they couldn't see. The crews settled into a daily routine, like a factory shift. The calculation was crudely made, and then they fired what were called ranging shots. The crew had an approximate idea where the shells were going to land, and if unsure, they'd hopefully fire longer rather than shorter, so they wouldn't hit their own troops, which did happen too often anyway. And then on the other end was the artillery observer, the guy with the telephone, or when the wires got cut by enemy shelling, which happened all the time, it came down to runners or pigeons. He was reporting where the shells were landing and how to make corrections. However, armies went to war with small stocks of shells, about 1,000 rounds per gun, which they thought would be enough for a 6-month war. And most of these were shrapnel. Well, within 2 months, all armies were running short of shells. Shrapnel was useless against the troops in the trenches and dugouts, and more importantly, it was useless for cutting the wire. So production was ramped up, with shells getting top priority. And while the men were busy fighting the war, women had to step in and work in factories around the clock. And quite a few of them lost their lives in factory accidents. As the war went on, the shells started evolving. There came a smoke shell to screen movement and blind the enemy observers, or a star shell which had a small parachute and released a burning magnesium flare to light up no man's land at night. And the most infamous were definitely the gas shells. And you're going to hear what those did to a human body and why they aren't used anymore. But before that, here's how bad life for the artillery crew was, even on what was called a good day. First, the crew had to set the gun up, which sounds easy until you remember that it was done in the mud and shattered terrain. Once the gun was up, then came the firing. They would fire some 800 to 1,000 shells a day, even in normal conditions, and each shell weighed anywhere from 18 to 200 pounds, depending on the caliber. So the crews had quite the weight going through their hands each day. Then there's deafness, as there was no ear protection equipment used, so crews had to improvise with whatever they could put in their ears, and a lot of them had various degrees of hearing loss after the war. The guns themselves were literally ticking bombs, because at any moment something called a premature could happen. Not that premature, but the premature detonation of the shell while it was still in the gun barrel. This happened mostly early in the war, when that shell crisis hit and all armies started producing shells with poor quality control and whatever materials they had. Pair that with the wear on the guns, firing far more rounds than they were ever designed for, and the result was that the gun would blow itself up and kill anyone standing around it, horribly often. This happened to over 600 French guns in 1915, while the Germans had it even worse and lost 2,300 field guns and 900 light howitzers to premature explosions in the same year. And that's as many as were knocked out by enemy action, by the way. Now, going back to the gas shells, before these, the method was to release toxic gases from the cylinders and let the wind blow them toward the enemy line. But that turned out not to be the smartest solution, because, as you can imagine, the wind could change direction. And after it did a couple of times, artillery crews had one more thing to worry about, since there were now a few more shell types with different substances inside. These substances, when the shell burst, would burn the person's lungs from the inside once inhaled, which then caused swelling and accumulation of fluid that led to drowning. Or the mustard gas, later introduced by the Germans, which was a blistering agent that caused severe blisters on the skin and was designed to maim, not to kill. We have a whole video about chemical weapons on our channel, so you can watch that later if you want to go down that rabbit hole. But the thing is that these shells were used by artillery crews and also against them. So they had to handle thousands of shells filled with toxic substances and work with their gas masks on. And counter-battery fire would gladly use gas shells against the enemy's artillery crews. And guess what happens if the cache of gas shells gets hit by enemy artillery? The other unfortunate victims around the guns, besides their crews, were the horses. Field artillery ran on horsepower, quite literally, with 6 to 12 horses around each gun, so millions of horses, mules, and donkeys were used over the course of the war. And they suffered more than the men did, exposed to all the dangers of the front and pulling the heavy load all the time on top of that. The artillery batteries and their crews were also targets, and actually top priority targets, as the side that could silence the enemy guns had a massive advantage. This was called counter-battery fire, where opposing artillery batteries were basically having a duel, firing at each other and trying to land their shells on the enemy guns before the enemy did the same to them. And by 1917, two methods had been worked out to locate the enemy battery's position. One was flash spotting, where observers in different places took compass bearings on the muzzle flash, and wherever the bearings crossed on a map, there was the battery, approximately. The other, much more effective one was sound ranging. A team would lay an array of microphones across several miles and then listen for the enemy guns firing. The tiny time differences as the boom reached each microphone were then fed into special formulas developed by civilian physicists to calculate where the sound was coming from. And it was accurate within tens of meters, which is exactly what you need to give your artillery battery to ruin the day for the enemy crews. This calculation could be done faster than the enemy could relocate their guns, so it was very effective later in the war, once it was perfected. Once the battery was under fire, there was no running to cover and abandoning the gun. They had to stand there and do their job as if nothing was happening. The artillery was growing in reach, and the major type was the howitzer, but it also went in two more directions, both at opposite extremes. One direction was the trench mortars, which were light and could be fired from the forward trench. Everyone hated them because they could lob the bombs in a high arc at low speed and drop them inside the enemy trenches. The bomb could actually be seen as it flew. The trench mortar was hated by both sides, by the enemy as it was effective and by the friendly troops as it would provoke immediate retaliation. The mortar team would come, fire a few shells, then pack up and leave. And then came the strong counter from the enemy artillery, exactly on that spot, so the infantry now got shelled. Now, the other direction was the extremely long-ranged, oversized, so-called railway guns, as they couldn't be moved any other way. The most famous is the German Paris gun, which was used to shell Paris from 120 kilometers away. Its shells reached a maximum altitude of about 40 kilometers, the greatest height any man-made object had hit until the Germans broke the record again in the next war with the V2 rocket. But the weapon was pretty much useless for anything other than terrorizing the population, as it would wear out just after a few dozen shots. The artillery changed from the support branch to the main killer on the battlefield. Some 60% or more of all of World War I casualties were due to artillery. It broke the men it didn't even hit directly, just by the sheer volume of constant shelling and the death it could bring at any moment, at any place, in the trenches. The amount of ammunition fired during the war was enormous. Total estimates range from several 100 million to over 1 billion shells fired collectively by all armies. And the dud rate estimates, meaning the shells that landed and didn't explode, went as high as 30%. So you can now work out the math on how many of them were left in the ground. The French Clearance Service still recovers about 900 tons of unexploded munitions every year, and since 1946, 630 ordnance workers have died when these went off. The worst hit areas, like Verdun, where on average 6 shells fell on every square meter, were sealed off as the red zone and declared unfit to live in. Aren't we an interesting species?